On the morning of my 70th birthday, my son sent me a text message. It read, "Plans changed. You are not coming on the cruise. My wife wants only her family." The next day, I canceled the payments, sold the house they lived in, and left town. When they returned from the ocean, the house was not theirs. My name is Howard. I am 70 years old, and I spent my life building a commercial freight empire from the ground up, only to realize I had funded my own erasure. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their entitlement, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful family member a lesson they will never forget. I stood in the center of my living room. Two heavy leather suitcases sat by the front door. My passport rested on the kitchen island next to a printed itinerary for a 10-day luxury Caribbean cruise. The ship was scheduled to depart from Miami in exactly 6 hours. I had arranged the airport transfer for noon. My phone vibrated against the marble countertop. I picked it up, expecting a call from the private car service. It was a text message from my son, Jordan. I opened the notification. The words glowed on the bright screen. "Dad, plans changed. You are not coming on the cruise. Nicole wants only her family on this trip to keep the peace. We gave your ticket to her parents, and we will celebrate with you when we get back." I read the message twice. I did not drop the phone. I did not yell at the empty room. I simply stared at the gray text bubble. The silence in my house was absolute. The message was not an apology. It was a cold dismissal. Jordan did not call to hear my voice or offer a genuine explanation. He sent a cowardly digital note while he was likely already standing in the private boarding terminal. I had paid for every single aspect of this vacation. It was explicitly planned as my 70th birthday celebration. Now Nicole's parents, Robert and Susan Stanton, were boarding a luxury vessel using my boarding pass. They were going to drink premium champagne and sleep in an ocean view suite that I financed. Jordan had simply erased me from my own milestone. The bags by my door suddenly looked like monuments to my own foolishness. I did not feel a trace of sadness. Sadness implies a loss of something valuable. What I felt was a cold, analytical, and terrifying rage. I walked over to the kitchen island and pulled out the physical receipt for the trip. I ran my finger down the itemized charges. The grand total was exactly $50,000. I had booked the penthouse suites, the premium dining packages, and the exclusive excursion passes. I had spared absolutely no expense because Jordan convinced me this would be a historic family bonding experience. He looked me in the eye a month ago and promised this trip would bridge the growing divide between us. He lied. The numbers on the paper stared back at me, mocking my generosity. Jordan did not view me as a father. He viewed me as a limitless, automated bank teller. He believed my purpose in his life was to silently generate capital and then step into the shadows whenever my presence inconvenienced his wife. Nicole despised me. She always had. She tolerated my existence only when it resulted in a direct financial deposit into her lifestyle. Robert and Susan Stanton shared her disdain, looking down their noses at me during holiday dinners while eagerly consuming the prime rib I purchased. They felt entitled to my wealth simply because their daughter had married my son. Jordan had facilitated this disrespect for years. He had slowly traded his dignity and my position in his life to appease a family that viewed us as nothing more than a funding source. I had ignored the subtle insults. I had brushed aside the canceled dinners and the forgotten phone calls. I had justified Jordan's behavior by blaming his stressful career. But this text message was a line drawn in concrete. It was the ultimate calculation of my worth to him. I placed my hands flat on the cold marble counter. I looked down at the thick, raised scars across my knuckles. Those scars were the map of my life. I did not inherit a trust fund. I did not have wealthy parents to leverage my early mistakes. I started as a night shift dock worker on the south side of Chicago. I saved every single dollar I earned, bought one used freight truck, and drove it myself for 5 grueling years. I fought through decades of systemic barriers, cutthroat competitors and brutal Midwest winters to build a commercial logistics empire. My company now operated a massive fleet of 200 trucks across the country. I had broken my back so my son would never have to know the smell of diesel fumes or the deep ache of a 12-hour manual labor shift. I handed Jordan a remarkably soft life. I paid for his exclusive private schooling, his completely debt-free university degree, and the massive down payment on his current home. I constructed an impenetrable financial fortress to protect him from the harsh realities of the world I had conquered. My reward for a lifetime of grueling labor was to be discarded via a cowardly text message on the morning of my 70th birthday. Jordan took the strength of my legacy and used it to fund his own weakness. He used my hard-earned money to buy the affection of a family that constantly ridiculed my blue-collar origins. He repaid a lifetime of immense sacrifice with the ultimate form of disrespect. I was no longer a father to him. I was merely an open vault. I did not reply to Jordan's text message. Sending a response pleading for an explanation or arguing about the unfairness of the situation would only give him the satisfaction of knowing he had successfully hurt me. I absolutely refused to grant him that power. I opened my laptop and completely bypassed the cruise itinerary folder. I logged directly into my highly secure corporate banking portal. My mind moved with the precise mechanical efficiency of a heavy freight engine. I navigated to the active accounts management page. I located the platinum corporate credit card I had handed Jordan just last week to cover the incidental onboard expenses for the luxury trip. He had already linked that specific card to the main cruise ship folio to cover all exotic spa treatments, premium alcohol purchases, and expensive casino chips for his entire group. He fully intended to let my logistics company absorb the massive cost of the Stanton family vacation. I clicked on the specific card number. The digital screen prompted me with a final security warning, asking if I was certain about the action. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I initiated the conflict by clicking a single red button. Freeze account immediately. The banking system confirmed the action with a brief loading screen. The platinum card was now effectively a piece of useless plastic. Any future attempt to authorize a charge would instantly trigger a hard, embarrassing decline. Jordan, Nicole, and the Stantons were currently stepping onto a massive vessel bound for international waters, completely unaware that their limitless financial lifeline had just been brutally severed. I closed the laptop with a sharp snap. The silence in the house was no longer heavy and oppressive. It was electric with anticipation. I grabbed the handles of my two heavy leather suitcases and rolled them firmly toward the master bedroom. I had no intention of going to Miami. I had a much more important, devastating itinerary to execute right here at home. I left my heavy leather suitcases standing in the hallway and walked straight into my home office. I picked up the receiver on my desk and dialed the direct line of my commercial real estate broker. His name was Pierce. He handled the acquisitions for my logistics company, operating with the exact same ruthless efficiency I demanded from my dispatchers. He answered on the second ring. I bypassed the usual pleasantries and instructed him to pull the file on the suburban property located in the Oakwood subdivision. That was the pristine 4-bedroom house Jordan and Nicole currently occupied. Pierce hesitated for a fraction of a second before bringing up the digital record. The property was not in my son's name. It never had been. It was legally registered under a subsidiary of my freight holding company. 2 weeks prior, an aggressive corporate investment firm had submitted an unsolicited all-cash offer for the lot. They wanted to tear down the existing structures in that neighborhood to build high-density luxury townhomes. I had instructed Pierce to ignore the offer at the time. Now I told him to accept it immediately. Pierce warned me that the buyers were demanding an expedited closing process. They wanted the deed transferred and the property entirely vacant within 7 days. I told him that timeline was absolutely perfect. I authorized him to draft the final acceptance letter and forward the documents to my email for an immediate digital signature. Pierce did not ask questions about my sudden change of heart. He knew better than to question my directives. He promised to have the paperwork ready in 10 minutes. I hung up the phone. The physical structure that provided my son with his comfortable, arrogant life was now officially a liquidated asset. I sat back in my leather chair and allowed myself a moment of pure clarity regarding Nicole. She was a white woman who weaponized her perceived social standing to mask a glaring financial void. She came from a family that projected immense wealth, but possessed absolutely zero liquid capital. At every country club dinner and neighborhood association meeting, Nicole proudly boasted to her affluent friends that she and Jordan had purchased the Oakwood property entirely on their own. She curated an elaborate fantasy of independent success. I had watched her smile and accept compliments on her brilliant real estate investment, while I quietly paid the annual property taxes and the monthly maintenance fees. I had originally purchased that house 2 years ago to save Jordan from total bankruptcy. He had mismanaged his personal finances to the point of ruin trying to keep up with Nicole's insatiable demands for designer clothes and imported cars. I stepped in and bought the property to put a solid roof over his head. I allowed Nicole to maintain her elaborate lie because I believed it preserved the peace within our family. I swallowed my pride and let Robert and Susan Stanton look down on my working-class background, knowing perfectly well my calloused hands were secretly financing their daughter's pristine suburban illusion. That illusion was now utterly shattered. The peace I had tried so desperately to protect was officially dead. Jordan had demonstrated that my sacrifices meant absolutely nothing to him. By barring me from a trip I funded just to appease his wife's elitist parents, he proved he valued their approval over my dignity. I was done subsidizing my own disrespect. I refused to let my hard-earned freight money maintain a fantasy for people who treated me like a disposable utility. The reality of their financial incompetence was about to crash down on them with the force of a runaway freight train. The notification chime on my laptop broke the silence in the room. Pierce had forwarded the transfer documents. I opened the encrypted file and read through the aggressive terms set by the corporate buyer. They required immediate possession of the property to begin their demolition schedule. Under normal circumstances, evicting a tenant requires a lengthy legal process involving grace periods and court orders. However, Jordan and Nicole were not legal tenants. They had never signed a lease agreement. They had never paid a single dime in rent to my holding company. They were legally classified as non-paying occupants. My corporate attorney had deliberately structured the property holding this way to protect my assets. This specific legal loophole allowed the corporate buyer to bypass standard eviction protocols entirely. I scrolled to the bottom of the digital contract. I did not feel a single tremor in my hand as I applied my digital signature to the final line. I waived all occupancy protections. The moment the funds cleared the escrow account, the new owners had the absolute legal right to secure their property. They could order a clean-out crew to remove any remaining unauthorized property from the premises without a single day of warning. I forwarded the signed documents back to Pierce with a strict command to expedite the wire transfer. The transaction was complete. Jordan and Nicole were currently drinking champagne on a luxury vessel, completely oblivious to the fact that their beautifully curated suburban home was already gone. They were legally trespassing on property they no longer had any right to access. I stood up from my desk and grabbed the heavy leather suitcases I had packed for the Miami cruise. I carried them through the empty hallway and loaded them into the back of my SUV. I locked the front door of my Chicago estate and activated the perimeter security system. I had no intention of remaining in the city to wait for the inevitable fallout. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. I programmed my navigation system for a remote fishing cabin I owned in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It was a secluded property entirely off the grid, surrounded by dense pine forests and the freezing waters of Lake Superior. It was the perfect place to watch a storm unfold. I merged onto the interstate and accelerated north. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt provided a deep mechanical comfort. I had driven heavy freight trucks across these exact same highways for 20 years. I knew how to navigate a long, difficult road. Exactly 2 hours into the drive, the absolute silence of the car interior was broken. My cell phone vibrated violently inside the center console. I glanced at the glowing screen. It was an automated fraud alert from my corporate bank, immediately followed by an incoming call from Jordan. The cruise ship purser was attempting to run the platinum card for their initial boarding folios and premium upgrade packages. The card was hitting a hard decline. The financial execution I had initiated was making its first strike. The battleground had officially shifted to the middle of the ocean. The freezing wind coming off Lake Superior hit my face with the sharpness of shattered glass. I stood on the weathered wooden deck of my remote fishing cabin, breathing in the scent of wet pine and deep, dark water. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape. It was exactly the kind of environment that built my calloused hands and my freight empire. I had left the noise of Chicago 400 miles behind me. The absolute silence of the wilderness was a welcome reward after a lifetime of deafening diesel engines and crowded loading docks. That silence was violently broken by the harsh synthetic vibration of my cell phone against the rough-hewn timber of the deck railing. The screen illuminated the gathering twilight. The caller ID displayed my son's name. I let it ring 5 times. I wanted him to feel the stretch of those seconds. I wanted the panic to fully set in before I finally swiped the green icon and brought the device to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the chaotic, hyperventilating franticness exploding on the other end of the line. Jordan was breathing heavily, his voice entirely stripped of the smug arrogance he had carried just 24 hours earlier. He was practically shouting over the ambient background noise of a crowded cruise ship lobby. He demanded to know why the corporate card was declining. He frantically explained that the ship's purser had physically deactivated the electronic key cards to their 2 luxury penthouse suites. They were locked out in the hallway in their bathing suits. The ship's financial officer was standing in front of them, holding a ledger of accumulated charges. Jordan detailed the staggering onboard tab they had managed to rack up in a single afternoon. Vintage champagne delivered to the stateroom. Deep tissue couples massages at the Oceanic Spa. Beluga caviar ordered poolside. They had spent my money with the reckless abandon of royalty, utterly convinced the invisible vault would never close. The total bill currently sat at $5,000, and the maritime security team was politely but firmly refusing to let them access their luggage until a valid payment method was authorized. Jordan did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if I had enjoyed my 70th birthday. He immediately shifted the blame to the financial institution. He ordered me to call the corporate banking division and clear the fraud alert. He spoke to me with the impatient, commanding tone of a wealthy executive reprimanding an incompetent subordinate. He assumed I was simply a foolish old man who had forgotten to notify the bank of an international travel itinerary. He demanded I resolve the humiliation he was currently suffering in front of his wife and his in-laws. I listened to his entire tirade without interrupting. I let him exhaust his oxygen. I let him paint a vivid picture of his own pathetic entitlement. When he finally stopped to take a breath, the silence on the line stretched out into a cold, heavy void. I did not raise my voice. I did not express an ounce of anger. I spoke with the precise mechanical clarity of a man finalizing a commercial freight contract. I informed Jordan that there was absolutely no fraud alert on the account. I told him the bank had executed my exact, deliberate instructions. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the piece of paper where I had transcribed his morning message. I read his own words back to him, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp articulation. Plans changed. You are not coming on the cruise. Nicole wants only her family on this trip to keep the peace. The silence that followed my recitation was absolute. I could practically hear the gears grinding in Jordan's head as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He stammered. He attempted to backpedal. He tried to claim the text message was a misunderstanding, a poorly phrased attempt to give me a quiet weekend at home. I cut him off immediately. I stripped away his desperate excuses with cold, undeniable logic. I informed him that I fully respected his boundaries. He had explicitly stated that this vacation was exclusively for Nicole's family. I was simply enforcing the financial reality of his chosen guest list. If the Stantons were the only family permitted to enjoy the luxury of the ocean view suites, then the Stantons were the only family responsible for the $5,000 admission fee. I told Jordan to hand the ship's purser over to Robert Stanton. I suggested Robert use his own heavily boasted wealth to clear the champagne tab. Jordan began to panic. He begged me not to hang up. He pleaded that the ship's security officers were preparing to escort them off the vessel at the very next port of call in Mexico if the balance remained unpaid. He swore he would pay me back. He promised we could fix our relationship the moment he returned to Chicago. I looked out at the freezing dark expanse of the lake. I told my son that our relationship was already perfectly defined. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I did not press the end call button. I flipped the device over, slid the back casing off with my thumb, and physically ripped the battery out of the chassis. The screen went entirely black. The digital tether was permanently severed. I knew exactly what was happening on Deck 4 of that floating palace at that very moment. I had thoroughly read the maritime lien policies of that specific luxury cruise line. I knew the purser stood waiting with an unyielding smile and a portable credit card terminal. I knew Jordan was staring at his dead phone, the blood draining from his face as the realization of his complete financial abandonment took hold. He was forced to turn around and look at his wife and his arrogant in-laws. He had to verbally confess that his limitless well of money had instantly dried up. The humiliation would be absolute and inescapable. A line of wealthy passengers was undoubtedly watching the entire spectacle unfold. Robert Stanton, a man who built his entire identity on the projection of superior class and wealth, was forced to step forward. He had to open his designer wallet and produce his own credit cards to save his daughter from being marooned in a foreign port. I knew the dark, closely guarded secret regarding Robert Stanton's finances. I knew his credit limits were stretched to the absolute breaking point. Handing over that plastic to cover a sudden $5,000 charge would push the Stanton family to the very edge of total bankruptcy. The sheer embarrassment of having their affluent facade shattered in a public lobby would ignite a furious, burning rage. The luxury vacation was instantly transformed into a stressful, humiliating fight for survival. They were stranded in international waters, utterly stripped of their artificial power. I knew Jordan and Nicole would not reflect on their own cruelty. They would not accept responsibility for their greedy actions. Their public mortification would curdle into a desperate, vindictive vow of revenge. They would spend the remainder of that miserable cruise plotting a way to return to Chicago, break into my life, and forcibly take what they believed was rightfully theirs. I welcomed their retaliation. I stood on the cold deck of my cabin entirely at peace. Let them sail back to a home they no longer owned. I was ready for the war. 1 week passed. I remained at my cabin checking the perimeter cameras of my Chicago estate each evening while listening to the wind howl off the lake. I knew exactly when the flight from Miami touched down. I knew precisely how long the drive from the airport to the Oakwood subdivision took. I pictured the suffocating tension inside their airport transport vehicle. Robert and Susan Stanton had spent the last 7 days trapped on a luxury vessel they were forced to finance, boiling in their own unearned arrogance. Jordan and Nicole had spent those same 7 days desperately trying to formulate an excuse for the financial failure. They arrived at the suburban cul-de-sac, exhausted, furious, and utterly unprepared for the scene waiting on their pristine driveway. A massive commercial moving truck was parked across the freshly manicured lawn. 4 burly men in matching gray uniforms were actively hauling a velvet sectional sofa out the front door and depositing it carelessly onto the concrete sidewalk. It was the exact sofa Nicole had purchased using my corporate account 2 years prior. Jordan leaped from the passenger seat before the airport transport even came to a complete stop. He sprinted up the paved walkway, demanding an explanation from a worker carrying a stack of designer dining chairs. The worker ignored him completely and set the chairs next to a growing mountain of personal belongings. Boxes of clothes, kitchen appliances, and framed photographs were piled high under the midday sun. Nicole stumbled out of the vehicle, her face pale with absolute shock. She watched a man carry her expensive espresso machine out the door. She demanded the men stop immediately. She marched toward the front door to use her key. She jammed the metal into the deadbolt and pushed. The mechanism did not turn. The locks were already completely replaced. The house was sealed. The fortress she had used to project her fake wealth to the entire neighborhood was officially breached. Jordan lost whatever fragile composure he had left. He threw his luggage onto the grass and attempted to physically shove his way past two movers carrying a heavy oak dresser. He shouted that he was the homeowner and threatened them with assault charges. A sharp, authoritative voice cut through the chaos. A man in a sharp blue suit stepped out from the shadow of the moving truck. He was the property manager for the corporate acquisition firm. He was not alone. Two uniformed local police officers stepped forward, placing themselves directly between Jordan and the front door. The manager held a thick manila folder. He did not raise his voice. He operated with the absolute certainty of legal backing. He informed Jordan that the property was acquired in a cash transaction 5 days ago. The corporation required immediate demolition access, and all unauthorized property was being legally removed from the premises. Jordan laughed hysterically. He pointed at the house and told the manager he was completely insane. He claimed his name was on the mortgage. The manager calmly opened the folder. He pulled out the certified deed of transfer and held it up for the police officers to verify. The document clearly showed the original owner as a commercial holding company. The holding company belonged entirely to me. Jordan stared at the federal stamps on the paper. The reality of my corporate structure finally pierced his profound ignorance. He had never owned a single brick of that structure. I had purchased it under my logistics firm to shield him from his own creditors. I had legally liquidated it with a single signature. He was staring at irrefutable proof of his own financial irrelevance. Nicole refused to accept the reality written on the paper. She stormed across the lawn and stepped directly into the face of the lead police officer. She screamed that there was a massive mistake. She shrieked that her family was prominent, that her father was a respected businessman, and that she personally selected every piece of custom molding in the dining room. She demanded the officers arrest the property manager and the moving crew immediately for breaking and entering. The lead officer did not flinch. He looked at Nicole with profound professional exhaustion. He tapped the legal deed held by the manager. He informed Nicole that the paperwork was thoroughly verified by a municipal judge that very morning. He stated clearly, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, that she possessed zero legal right to the property. He delivered the final crushing blow. He told Nicole that she and her husband were currently criminal trespassers on corporate land. If they attempted to cross the threshold of the front door, they would be placed in handcuffs and transported to the county jail. The humiliation was absolute. Doors opened across the quiet suburban street. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches. Women from the local country club. Women Nicole had actively belittled and lied to about her immense wealth stood on the sidewalks holding their phones. They watched the pristine illusion of the successful young couple disintegrate in real time. Nicole's carefully constructed social standing was publicly slaughtered. She stood shivering on the curb, surrounded by cardboard boxes and discarded furniture. She looked around at the judgmental stares of the people she had spent years desperately trying to impress. The neighbors whispered among themselves, witnessing the brutal eviction of a woman who had constantly boasted about her superior financial acumen. Nicole covered her face, entirely unable to hide from the devastating consequences of her own arrogance. Robert and Susan Stanton stood frozen near the idling airport transport vehicle. The utter shock on their faces rapidly curdled into toxic, absolute disgust. Robert glared at Jordan. He looked at his son-in-law, not as a family member, but as a fraudulent, pathetic failure who had dragged his daughter into the gutter. The Stantons had built their entire identity on racial and class superiority, viewing my blue-collar origins with barely concealed contempt. Now they were standing on a public street, watching their daughter get thrown out of a house they falsely believed Jordan had purchased. Nicole turned to her husband. Her tears evaporated, replaced by a vicious, cornered panic. She grabbed the collar of Jordan's jacket and demanded he fix the situation immediately. She screamed that he needed to call me and force me to reverse the sale. Jordan knew a phone call would achieve absolutely nothing. My phone battery was still sitting on a wooden table 400 miles away. The profound embarrassment cracked something deep inside Jordan's mind. He realized he had no money, no home, and a furious set of in-laws demanding immediate restitution. Desperation breeds spectacular foolishness. He looked at Nicole and made a decision that crossed the line from a civil family dispute directly into a severe criminal offense. He told his wife to gather their essential bags and call a private car. He declared they were going directly to my primary estate in Chicago. He planned to break into my private study, physically breach my filing cabinets, and steal my corporate financial documents to seize control of the logistics accounts. He intended to rob the very man who had fed him. The conflict was no longer a matter of withheld credit cards or a canceled vacation. Jordan was actively choosing to become a felon. He grabbed a heavy duffel bag from the lawn and marched toward the street, fully prepared to destroy his own life just to maintain his wife's fraudulent luxury. Nightfall enveloped the remote Michigan cabin in total darkness. Inside, the only light came from the glowing screen of my laptop. I sat at the rustic wooden table with a mug of black coffee, watching the high-definition security feed from my Chicago estate. I had anticipated their desperation, but watching it unfold in real time was a different experience entirely. A dark sedan rolled to a stop at the edge of my gated driveway. Two figures emerged, their faces obscured by the shadows, but their frantic movements were unmistakable. Jordan and Nicole crept through the side garden, entirely bypassing the front entrance. They moved with the frantic energy of cornered animals. I switched the camera feed to the rear patio. Jordan retrieved a heavy rock from the landscaping border. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before bringing it down hard against the reinforced glass of the back door. The pane shattered, scattering crystalline shards across the imported hardwood floors of my kitchen. He reached through the jagged opening and unlocked the deadbolt. They stepped inside my home like invading scavengers. I watched my son march directly to the security panel on the wall. He punched in the master override code I had given him 5 years ago for emergencies. The red flashing light on the panel turned a steady, passive green. He disabled the silent alarm, fully intending to operate completely undetected. This was not a panicked mistake or an emotional outburst. This was a calculated, deliberate intrusion. They had crossed state lines, driven for hours in silence, and consciously decided to commit a felony against their own family. I leaned closer to the screen, tracking their movements as they bypassed the kitchen and headed straight for the east wing of the house. The target was my private office. I switched the camera view to the discreet dome lens mounted above my heavy mahogany desk. Jordan and Nicole burst into the office, leaving the heavy oak doors wide open. They immediately began tearing the room apart. Nicole yanked the drawers out of the filing cabinets, dumping decades of perfectly organized tax returns and corporate logistics manifests onto the Persian rug. Jordan swept his arm across my desk, knocking my brass reading lamp and framed photographs to the floor. They were hunting for vulnerable assets. They searched frantically for blank checkbooks, offshore account numbers, and any physical documentation that would grant them access to the liquid capital of my freight empire. I watched them ransack my private sanctuary with an overwhelming sense of entitlement. They did not view this as stealing. They viewed my wealth as their absolute birthright. In their twisted minds, they were merely accelerating an inevitable inheritance. Nicole frantically sifted through a stack of bank statements, her face illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. She muttered curses every time she found an account that was securely locked within the corporate holding structure. Jordan paced behind my desk, running his hands through his hair in sheer panic. He needed a financial lifeline to appease his furious in-laws and repair his shattered domestic illusion. He ripped the leather seating cushions off the visitor chairs, searching for a hidden safe he erroneously believed existed. They operated with the destructive carelessness of looters completely detached from the labor required to build a fortune. Every document they tossed aside represented years of grueling negotiations, missed sleep, and immense personal sacrifice on my part. They were trampling on my legacy, seeking a quick fix for the catastrophic failure of their own choices. The sheer arrogance of their actions solidified my resolve. I felt no parental pity watching my son reduce himself to a common thief. I clicked the record button on the security software, capturing every chaotic movement in pristine digital clarity. The trap was closing perfectly. They were providing me with all the ammunition required to permanently dismantle their unearned privilege. The frantic search yielded absolutely nothing of financial value. I had long ago digitized my critical assets and locked the physical backups inside a highly secure downtown bank vault. The realization of their failure began to set in. Jordan slumped against the wall, defeated and gasping for air. Nicole, however, refused to surrender. She dropped to her knees and began yanking open the deep bottom drawers of my desk. Her hands rummaged through old stationary spare charging cables and forgotten office supplies. Suddenly, her frantic movements stopped. She pulled her hand out of the darkest corner of the bottom drawer. Her fingers were tightly wrapped around a small amber plastic cylinder. It was an old prescription bottle. I stared at the screen, immediately recognizing the faded label. They were powerful sedatives. I had taken them for a brief, agonizing period 15 years ago, immediately following the sudden death of my wife. The grief had caused severe insomnia, and a physician had prescribed the heavy medication to force my body to sleep. I had long since stopped needing them, leaving the half-empty bottle forgotten in the depths of that drawer. Nicole stood up slowly. She held the amber bottle up to the harsh overhead light, examining the warning labels and the potent dosage instructions. A slow, chilling smile spread across her face. The panic that had consumed her earlier completely vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculating malice. She did not see a discarded medication bottle. She saw an ultimate weapon. She turned to Jordan and shook the plastic cylinder. The pills rattled loudly in the quiet room. She walked over to him, holding the bottle between their faces like a golden ticket. I turned up the volume on my laptop speakers. The hidden microphone embedded in the ceiling dome captured their conversation with crystal precision. Nicole spoke in a rapid, excited whisper. She outlined her new strategy with terrifying ease. She told Jordan they no longer needed to steal my money manually. They were going to steal me entirely. She pointed to the sedatives and explained the legal framework of an emergency psychiatric hold. Her plan was diabolical. They would claim they broke into the house because they were deeply concerned for my mental well-being. They would present the heavy sedatives to a judge and state under oath that I had threatened to end my own life. They would testify that the sudden sale of their house and the cancellation of the cruise were the erratic, dangerous actions of a man losing his mind. Nicole detailed how they could use this fabricated narrative to declare me legally incompetent. By establishing an emergency guardianship, Jordan would be granted absolute immediate control over my entire freight company and all my personal assets. Jordan stared at the pill bottle. He hesitated, but only for a brief moment. The allure of total financial domination easily overpowered whatever remaining moral compass he possessed. He nodded in agreement, fully committing to the destruction of his father. They stood in the wreckage of my office and finalized their conspiracy to strip me of my freedom, my business, and my dignity. I sat in the dark cabin watching the audio waves peak and dip on the recording software. I captured every single word of their malicious plot. They believed they had just discovered the ultimate loophole. In reality, they had just handed me the final irrefutable evidence required to bury them both. The sun had barely crested the tree line above Lake Superior when a sharp notification ping echoed through the silent timber cabin. I sat at the rustic dining table, a mug of black coffee cooling beside my laptop. I had spent the night reviewing the high-definition security footage of my son turning into a felon. The screen illuminated a new unread email in my primary inbox. The sender address belonged to a low-tier legal firm based out of a strip mall in a Chicago suburb. The subject line read, "Urgent confidential settlement demand regarding Howard Logistics Holdings." I clicked the message open. The text was dressed up in formal legal jargon, but the underlying message was aggressively primitive. The attorney, a man clearly hungry for a quick payout from a massive corporate target, represented Jordan and Nicole. He outlined a severe immediate crisis regarding my mental stability and physical safety. The letter stated that my family was deeply distressed by my recent erratic financial behaviors, specifically citing the sudden, unprovoked sale of their primary residence. To mitigate the imminent public scandal and secure my ongoing medical care without involving state authorities, the lawyer demanded a rapid resolution. They required a direct, untraceable wire transfer of $500,000 into a specified escrow account by the close of business on Friday. If the funds cleared, my son and daughter-in-law would graciously step back and allow me to seek private treatment in isolation. The audacity of the demand was almost breathtaking. They had completely bypassed a simple request for help. They had sprinted straight past begging and landed directly on criminal blackmail. Jordan believed that the threat of public embarrassment and corporate instability would force my hand. He assumed a self-made logistics CEO would panic at the prospect of a board revolt and quietly pay the ransom to make the problem disappear. I scrolled down to the bottom of the email and opened the attached digital files. The first document was a fully drafted, unsigned petition for emergency adult guardianship. It laid out a fabricated narrative detailing my supposed rapid cognitive decline. The petition claimed I had developed severe paranoia, deliberately isolated myself from my loving family, and began making catastrophic business decisions that threatened the livelihood of hundreds of employees. It was a perfectly weaponized document designed to terrify a judge into granting an immediate ex parte order, stripping me of my civil rights. The second attachment was far more insidious. It was a sworn, notarized affidavit signed by Nicole. In cold, precise language, my daughter-in-law detailed a fictitious encounter that supposedly occurred 3 days prior to my departure. She swore under penalty of perjury that she had visited my Chicago estate to drop off birthday gifts. She claimed I answered the door in a state of wild, unhinged delirium holding a registered firearm. The affidavit stated I leveled the weapon at her chest, screamed nonsensical threats about corporate spies, and physically forced her off the property. It was pure, unadulterated extortion. Nicole was weaponizing the justice system to secure a $500,000 payout. She knew that a formal accusation involving a firearm and elder dementia would trigger an automatic police response, a mandatory psychiatric hold, and the immediate suspension of my corporate executive authority. She was holding a loaded legal gun to the head of my legacy. They had broken into my home, discovered my discarded sedatives, and instantly woven them into a deadly narrative of a suicidal, dangerous old man. The extortion relied entirely on my fear of the consequences. They bet my entire freight empire on the assumption that I would fold under the pressure of a fabricated criminal investigation. They viewed the $500,000 as a cheap settlement compared to the total destruction of my reputation. They did not realize that I had spent the night watching them orchestrate the very crime they were now trying to project onto me. I stared at the digital signature at the bottom of Nicole's perjured statement. A ghost from my past walked straight out of the screen. 30 years ago, I sat across a polished conference table from Jordan's mother, during our exceptionally bitter divorce proceedings. She had employed the exact same manipulative legal tactics. When I refused to surrender a massive percentage of the commercial trucking fleet I had built with my own bleeding hands, she pivoted to extortion. She drafted a series of vicious, false affidavits claiming physical abuse and erratic behavior. She threatened to release the documents to my primary shipping clients, promising to destroy my professional reputation if I did not sign over the company shares. I had looked her directly in the eyes and told her to burn the entire empire to ash, because I would never pay a ransom to keep what was already mine. I went to court, endured the brutal public scrutiny, proved her claims were malicious fabrications, and walked away with my company completely intact. Jordan had absorbed his mother's most toxic survival strategies. He had internalized the belief that lying and emotional terrorism were acceptable tools to acquire wealth without labor. He was trying to execute the exact same extortion play his mother had failed to deliver 3 decades earlier. He truly believed age had softened my resolve. He thought a 70-year-old man would lack the stamina for a brutal legal war. He was tragically mistaken. The fire that had driven me to build a logistics giant out of a single-used diesel truck had never extinguished. I had absolutely refused to bow to his mother's blackmail when I had everything to lose. I would certainly not bow to a cowardly son who had already lost his leverage. I picked up my phone and dialed a private number securely stored in my encrypted contacts. Gavin was the lead corporate litigator for my holding company. He was a shark dressed in custom wool, a man who dismantled rival logistics firms with surgical precision. He answered on the first ring. I did not bother with morning pleasantries. I instructed Gavin to open his secured email channel immediately. I forwarded the extortion demand, the drafted guardianship petition, and Nicole's perjured affidavit. I then attached the massive high-definition video file I had downloaded from my home security server. The video clearly depicted Jordan and Nicole smashing my back door, bypassing the alarm panel, tearing my private study to shreds, and openly discussing their malicious plot to frame me using old sedatives. Gavin reviewed the materials in absolute silence. I could hear his steady breathing over the line as he processed the sheer magnitude of the criminal conspiracy. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the cold, sharp edge of a blade being drawn. He confirmed that the opposing attorney's demand letter that crossed the legal threshold into federal extortion, and the break-in secured multiple felony charges. He asked if I wanted to dispatch the police to arrest them immediately. I declined. Arresting them now would simply result in a swift plea deal. I wanted a total, inescapable annihilation of their entitlement. I instructed Gavin to reply to the amateur attorney. I told him to feign panic. He was to project the image of a desperate corporate lawyer trying to quietly manage an erratic, terrified CEO. I ordered Gavin to lay a very specific trap. We were going to invite Jordan and Nicole to play their legal game on our battlefield. We were going to lure them into a room where their greed would permanently lock the cell door behind them. I sat in the leather armchair across from Gavin's expansive mahogany desk. The morning sun illuminated the towering skyline of downtown Chicago outside his floor-to-ceiling windows. Gavin placed his sleek mobile phone on the center of the desk and activated the high-definition speaker. He tapped the contact number for the strip mall attorney Jordan had hired to deliver the extortion demand. The line rang twice before a reedy, overly confident voice answered. Gavin did not unleash his usual aggressive litigation tactics. Instead, he completely altered his posture and tone. He lowered his voice to a hushed, confidential murmur. He masterfully projected the image of a deeply concerned corporate protector dealing with a rapidly deteriorating situation. Gavin informed the opposing counsel that he had received the drafted petition for emergency guardianship and the sworn affidavit from Nicole. He paused for dramatic effect, allowing a heavy sigh to transmit across the digital connection. Gavin confessed entirely off the official record that the logistics corporate board was already managing a delicate internal crisis regarding my mental acuity. He lied with absolute terrifying conviction. He stated that I had recently suffered severe memory lapses during crucial international freight negotiations. He conceded that the sudden, unprovoked liquidation of the suburban property was indeed an erratic, uncharacteristic mistake driven by cognitive decline. Gavin painted a vivid picture of a 70-year-old man utterly terrified of public exposure, humiliated by his failing mind, and completely unequipped to handle a brutal, highly publicized courtroom battle. He explained that a public hearing regarding my competency would instantly crash the company's valuation and trigger a mass exodus of our primary shipping clients. The opposing attorney remained silent, eagerly absorbing the fabricated narrative. He audibly shifted papers, clearly believing he had just struck the ultimate legal goldmine. Gavin then carefully presented our calculated counteroffer. To avoid the catastrophic media circus of a forced psychiatric evaluation and the subsequent destruction of the freight empire, he proposed a private, immediate settlement. He offered to surrender quietly, giving Jordan and Nicole exactly what they thought they had bullied me into surrendering, provided they dropped the emergency medical hold petition forever. Gavin articulated the specific terms of our surrender. He proposed that I voluntarily sign a limited power of attorney document. This legal instrument would officially grant Jordan direct administrative access to a single highly funded domestic bank account. Gavin explained that this specific account held sufficient capital to replace their lost suburban home and sustain their lavish lifestyle indefinitely. It was a compromise designed to sound like a desperate attempt to protect the larger corporate holdings while pacifying an aggressive heir. The opposing attorney immediately placed Gavin on a brief hold. He conferenced Jordan and Nicole onto a secondary line to relay the magnificent news. I watched the blinking light on Gavin's speakerphone. I knew exactly what was happening in whatever cheap rental Jordan was currently occupying. They were celebrating. They firmly believed my spirit was completely broken. They assumed their malicious threat of a psychiatric hold had successfully terrified me into total submission. 2 minutes later, the cheap lawyer returned to the active line. His voice dripped with unearned victory. He announced that his clients graciously accepted the preliminary terms of the settlement. They were willing to halt the emergency guardianship petition and keep the police out of my personal affairs, provided the financial access was established by the end of the week. They swallowed the bait without inspecting the hook. They viewed the single bank account as their rightful prize for a perfectly executed extortion strategy. Gavin assured the lawyer that the corporate legal team would draft the documents immediately to expedite the transfer of power. He terminated the call and looked at me across the desk. The first phase of the trap was perfectly set. We had successfully convinced 2 arrogant criminals that they were the smartest people in the room. We did not utilize the opposing attorney for the next phase of the operation. Gavin drafted the digital limited power of attorney document and prepared to deliver it directly into my son's hands. He bypassed the strip mall lawyer entirely, citing a need for extreme corporate discretion. Gavin composed a highly secure email addressed specifically to Jordan's personal inbox. He attached the drafted PDF files outlining the exact parameters of the financial surrender. However, Gavin included a very specific, deliberate set of instructions within the body of the email. He explicitly stated that these digital files were strictly for preliminary review. He noted that the documents were currently locked by our corporate security protocols and could not be legally executed until our scheduled in-person meeting on Friday morning. Gavin emphasized that the word limited was binding, restricting Jordan's access exclusively to the single domestic account detailed in Section 4. He warned Jordan that any attempt to utilize the document before the official signing ceremony in our downtown boardroom would invalidate the entire settlement offer. I reviewed the outgoing message before Gavin pressed send. The email was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It presented Jordan with the keys to the kingdom, while simultaneously erecting a fragile glass wall between his greed and his reward. We were not merely giving him a legal document to review. We were handing a starving predator a piece of raw meat and explicitly ordering him not to take a bite until Friday. The digital packet left Gavin's secure server and landed instantly in Jordan's inbox. I knew my son's psychological profile intimately. He lacked the fundamental patience required to wait for a scheduled victory. He possessed an insatiable need for immediate gratification. Jordan and Nicole were entirely too greedy to accept the parameters of our generous compromise. They had broken into my home, smashed my glass, and threatened to throw me into a psychiatric ward. A single domestic account was never going to satisfy their boundless entitlement. They wanted the logistics empire. They wanted the massive offshore corporate funds I used to maintain my international shipping fleet. The moment Gavin's email registered on Jordan's laptop, the trap snapped shut on their ankle. They did not review the document and wait patiently for Friday morning. They immediately downloaded the locked PDF file onto their personal hard drive. I knew exactly what they were thinking. They viewed the word limited as an unacceptable insult. They believed they had the absolute upper hand, and they were not going to let a corporate lawyer dictate the boundaries of their conquered territory. Nicole, driven by the same malicious audacity that allowed her to perjure herself on a sworn affidavit, convinced Jordan that they needed to modify the agreement. They began actively searching for a method to digitally bypass the security protocols embedded in Gavin's file. They sought a way to alter the specific clauses of the legal document before the final printing. Their objective was to secretly delete the restrictive language transforming the limited power of attorney into a general power of attorney. This unauthorized alteration would legally grant them total, unmitigated control over every single financial asset associated with my name, including the protected offshore logistics funds. They thought they were executing a brilliant, undetectable maneuver to secure total financial supremacy. In reality, they were blindly walking into a highly sophisticated digital surveillance net. Every action they took to alter that file was leading them directly to a federal penitentiary. I sat in the corner of Gavin's expansive downtown office, a sharp contrast to the chaotic wreckage Jordan and Nicole had left in my own home. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, uninterrupted view of the Chicago skyline. But my attention remained entirely locked on a specialized high-definition monitor positioned in the center of the mahogany desk. Gavin's corporate security division operated with military precision. They had not simply attached a standard document to the email sent to my son. They had embedded a heavily tracked secure server link designed to monitor every single digital interaction with the file in real time. We were not passively waiting for a response. We were actively surveilling a digital ambush. The room was absolutely silent, save for the faint, steady hum of the climate control system. Gavin sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the screen, a predator waiting for the inevitable misstep. He knew human greed better than anyone. He knew the fragile psychological profile of a desperate man cornered by his own failures. Exactly 42 minutes after the initial email transmission, a sharp, piercing chime broke the silence in the room. A bright red notification banner flashed across the top of the monitor. The trap was officially triggered. The secure server registered a direct connection. The system instantly displayed the incoming Internet Protocol address. Gavin typed a rapid command into his keyboard, running a geolocation trace on the signal. The results populated on the screen in seconds. The connection originated from a short-term rental property located precisely 3 miles from my shattered suburban estate. It was Jordan. He had not waited for the Friday meeting. He had ignored the explicit legal warnings regarding unauthorized access. Driven by an insatiable, blinding greed, he had clicked the secure link and opened the digital file directly within the monitored environment. The bait was successfully taken. Now we simply had to watch him swallow the hook. The monitoring software deployed by Gavin's team was incredibly sophisticated. It allowed us to observe the exact live interactions occurring within the digital document boundary. The screen mirrored Jordan's desktop application. We watched a cursor blink rapidly across the digital pages. Jordan and Nicole were not merely reading the terms of their surrender. They were actively dismantling them. The cursor hovered over the bold heading of the document. I watched in cold fascination as the backspace key systematically erased the word "limited" from the title. They moved down to Section 4, the specific clause restricting their access to a single domestic account. The cursor highlighted the entire paragraph. With a single keystroke, the restriction vanished. In its place, Jordan typed a broad, sweeping mandate granting himself total, unmitigated administrative authority over every corporate and personal financial asset bearing my name. He included the routing numbers for the offshore logistics funds. He was systematically rewriting the document to seize the entirety of my life's work. His arrogance was matched only by his profound ignorance of digital forensics. He believed he was executing a flawless, undetectable heist. He had no idea his every keystroke was being recorded on a secure corporate server. The final act of their conspiracy unfolded at the bottom of the page. Jordan did not wait for the Friday meeting to secure my physical authorization. He imported a high-resolution image file. It was a perfectly replicated digital copy of my personal signature, likely lifted from the stolen documents they had ransacked from my home office. He pasted the forged signature directly onto the authorization line. The document was now a completely fabricated, highly illegal instrument of financial theft. A final loading bar appeared on our screen as Jordan saved the forged document and uploaded it back to the corporate server, officially transmitting the stolen authority. Gavin leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands across his chest. The bright red upload confirmation remained frozen on the monitor, a digital tombstone for my son's future. Gavin turned to face me. The professional mask of a corporate attorney dropped, replaced by the stark, unyielding reality of a federal prosecutor. He did not speak in hypotheticals. He delivered the absolute legal truth with chilling clarity. He explained that a family dispute regarding inheritance or property ownership was a civil matter often handled quietly behind the closed doors of a local courthouse. However, Jordan had just entirely rewritten the rules of engagement. By deliberately altering a legally binding financial document, applying a forged digital signature, and utilizing an internet connection to transmit that fraudulent file across state lines back to our corporate server, Jordan had crossed a massive, inescapable threshold. He had not simply committed a petty theft. He had executed textbook federal wire fraud. Gavin outlined the severity of the statutes involved. The combination of identity theft, attempted corporate embezzlement, and the interstate transmission of forged documents triggered immediate federal jurisdiction. This was no longer a local dispute that could be resolved with a harsh reprimand and a canceled credit card. Jordan had willingly handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation all the necessary evidence to initiate a devastating criminal prosecution. He had transformed a greedy, entitled tantrum into a severe felony. Gavin looked at the screen, analyzing the digital footprint Jordan had permanently left behind. The IP addresses, the timestamps, the exact keystroke logs, and the forged signature file were now securely locked in our corporate vault. The trap had functioned with flawless, brutal efficiency. Jordan believed he had outsmarted a logistics empire. Instead, he had meticulously engineered his own absolute destruction. Gavin fell silent, allowing the heavy reality of the situation to settle into the room. He looked at me with a steady, uncompromising gaze. He explicitly warned me that there was absolutely no turning back once we officially mobilized this evidence. Initiating the legal process with these specific federal charges would remove all control from our hands. The prosecution would be merciless. Gavin stated clearly that pursuing this course of action guaranteed a mandatory lengthy prison sentence for my son. He asked me directly and without a shred of sentimentality if I was prepared to watch Jordan be stripped of his freedom and locked in a federal penitentiary. I did not look away. I did not feel a sudden rush of parental guilt or a desperate desire to protect the boy I had raised. I thought about the text message on the morning of my 70th birthday. I thought about the years of silent disrespect, the financial parasitism, and the absolute disdain from the Stanton family. I remembered the high-definition security footage of Jordan smashing through the glass of my back door, tearing my private sanctuary apart like a common street criminal. I remembered Nicole holding a bottle of sedatives, gleefully plotting to throw me into a psychiatric ward to steal my legacy. They had shown absolutely no mercy when they orchestrated my destruction. I had no mercy left to offer. Jordan had demanded a war, and he had chosen his own weapons. I simply provided the battlefield. I looked at the forged signature resting on the monitor. I turned my attention back to my attorney. My voice was steady, void of any hesitation or regret. I gave Gavin the absolute irrevocable order to proceed. Friday morning broke with a sharp, blinding light glaring off the steel and glass canyons of downtown Chicago. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy elevator doors on the 42nd floor parted. Jordan and Nicole stepped into the pristine reception area of Gavin's corporate law firm. They did not arrive alone. Robert and Susan Stanton flanked them, moving with the synchronized, practiced entitlement of people who believed the world existed entirely to serve them. They bypassed the receptionist, completely ignoring her polite greeting, and marched straight down the corridor toward the primary glass-walled conference room. They walked with the posture of conquering monarchs arriving to survey a newly acquired territory. Jordan wore an expensive linen suit he could no longer afford, his chin raised in a portrait of manufactured confidence. Nicole clutched a designer handbag, her face set in a mask of triumphant smugness. The Stantons radiated a toxic, suffocating arrogance. They surveyed the expansive mahogany table, the panoramic views of the city skyline, and the leather executive chairs with naked greed. They were treating a legal surrender as a coronation ceremony. Jordan pulled out a chair at the absolute head of the table, physically claiming the space traditionally reserved for the senior executive. He motioned for his wife and his in-laws to take the seats immediately to his right. They arranged themselves with deliberate theatrical superiority. They were entirely convinced that their extortion plot had been executed with flawless precision. They believed they had successfully bullied a supposedly senile, frightened old man into surrendering a vast financial empire. They sat in the immaculate boardroom, whispering excitedly among themselves, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just willingly locked themselves inside a perfectly constructed legal slaughterhouse. Gavin entered the conference room exactly 5 minutes late. He carried a single unmarked manila folder. He did not offer a handshake or a welcoming smile. He walked to the opposite end of the mahogany table and stood completely still. Robert Stanton immediately attempted to seize absolute control of the room. He leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the polished wood. He looked at Gavin not as a highly respected corporate litigator, but as a subordinate clerk summoned merely to fetch documents. Robert's voice dripped with the suffocating, unearned racial and class superiority that had defined his entire pathetic existence. He told Gavin to skip the customary legal pleasantries and hand over the final guardianship paperwork immediately. He stated they had busy schedules and no desire to waste time coddling a defeated man's pride. Robert bowed his hand dismissively, referring to the transfer of my freight empire as a minor administrative chore. He openly boasted about his intent to put the old man away in a quiet facility where he could no longer embarrass the family or endanger their financial future. Susan Stanton chimed in, offering a completely fabricated sigh of sympathetic exhaustion. She claimed the entire ordeal had been terribly draining on Nicole's delicate nerves and demanded that the asset transfer be expedited without any further dramatic delays. Jordan sat silently at the head of the table, smiling a weak, cowardly smile. He was letting his father-in-law fight his battles completely, surrendering his own agency to appease the Stantons. Robert tapped his expensive gold pen against the glass coaster, loudly demanding that Gavin produce the signature pages. He declared that they had already reviewed the digital drafts and found them perfectly acceptable. He possessed the absolute audacity to command my attorney to finalize the theft of my life's work. Gavin did not flinch. He did not open the manila folder. He simply stared at Robert Stanton, with eyes like cracked ice, letting the older man's toxic arrogance hang suspended in the dead silent air of the boardroom. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the conference room swung open with a resounding, heavy thud. The sound instantly shattered the manufactured confidence filling the room. Every head at the mahogany table snapped toward the entrance. I walked into the room. I did not shuffle. I did not lean on a cane. I did not project the fragile, terrified dementia patient they had painstakingly described in their fabricated legal petitions. I wore a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit that draped perfectly over my broad shoulders. My posture was absolutely rigid, forged by decades of manual labor on loading docks and countless hours dominating hostile corporate boardrooms. I moved with the steady, undeniable gravity of a man who owned every inch of the ground he walked upon. The air was instantly sucked out of the room. Jordan's smug smile vanished, replaced by a sudden sickening pale wash across his face. Nicole shrank back into her leather chair, her fingers white-knuckling the strap of her designer handbag. Robert Stanton's arrogant smirk froze, suspended in a state of sudden, absolute confusion. He had expected to see a broken, weeping old man ready to sign away his dignity for a scrap of peace. Instead, he was staring directly at a fully mobilized apex predator. I walked past the expensive leather chairs, completely ignoring the collective shock radiating from my son and his in-laws. I moved with a terrifying, deliberate slowness. The silence was absolute, heavy with the sudden realization that the narrative they had constructed was entirely false. I reached the center of the table and stood directly across from Jordan. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at him, allowing the sheer, crushing weight of my presence to suffocate the last remnants of his pathetic extortion plot. I deliberately refused to acknowledge Jordan's existence. I did not look at Nicole, nor did I offer a single glance toward the Stantons. I reached inside my tailored jacket and withdrew a thick, securely bound stack of printed documents. The high-gloss paper felt heavy and absolute in my hand. I raised my arm and dropped the entire stack directly onto the exact center of the polished mahogany conference table. The heavy slap of the paper hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly silent room. The top pages immediately fanned out, sliding precisely toward Jordan and Robert. They were not corporate financial transfers. They were high-resolution, full-color photographs captured directly from my Chicago estate's hidden security feeds. The images clearly depicted Jordan swinging a heavy rock through the reinforced glass of my back door. They showed Nicole frantically tearing through my private filing cabinets like a desperate scavenger. Scattered among the photographs were pages of densely coded IP server logs, highlighted in bright yellow marker. The data unequivocally mapped their exact digital location, pinpointing the precise moment they had downloaded, altered, and forged the limited power of attorney document. The timestamp aligned perfectly with the fraudulent digital signature uploaded from their rental property. I stood perfectly still, watching their eyes dart across the damning images. The complete comprehension of their catastrophic failure hit the table like a physical shockwave. Robert Stanton stared at the photograph of his daughter holding the amber bottle of sedatives, his jaw slack with sudden, terrifying understanding. Jordan looked at the server logs detailing his federal wire fraud, his breath hitching in his chest. The room fell utterly dead silent. The trap had sprung, and the steel teeth were buried deep in bone. The absolute silence in the boardroom was heavy enough to crush bone. I did not give them a single second to recover from the visual evidence scattered across the mahogany table. I reached into my interior jacket pocket and retrieved a sleek digital audio remote synced directly to Gavin's presentation system. With a single press of my thumb, the large invisible speakers embedded in the conference room ceiling crackled to life. The crystal-clear audio of my hidden office microphone flooded the space. Nicole's voice echoed off the glass walls, rapid, excited, and dripping with malicious intent. Every syllable she had spoken in the darkness of my home was now broadcast under the harsh fluorescent lights of downtown Chicago. The recording captured the exact moment she discovered the amber bottle of sedatives. The room listened as she gleefully explained the legal framework of an emergency psychiatric hold. Her recorded voice detailed how they would claim I had threatened my own life, how they would present the heavy medication to a judge, and how they would testify under oath that I was dangerously unstable. The audio clearly captured her outlining the ultimate goal, declaring that establishing an emergency guardianship would grant Jordan immediate absolute control over my entire freight company and all my personal assets. I watched the physical impact of her own words strike her. Nicole's perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently. The smug, triumphant mask she had worn into the room dissolved into an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. The recording concluded with the distinct rattling of the pill bottle and Jordan's weak, compliant murmur of agreement. The echo of their conspiracy faded, leaving nothing but the damning truth suspended in the air. They had walked into this room believing they were the architects of my destruction. They now realized they had meticulously authored their own criminal indictments. Nicole turned a ghastly shade of pale. The blood completely drained from her face as the magnitude of her legal exposure set in. She leaped up from her leather executive chair, her voice climbing to a hysterical shriek. She pointed a shaking finger at Gavin, screaming that the audio recording was a severe violation of state wiretapping laws. She demanded the immediate destruction of the files, loudly asserting that capturing private conversations without two-party consent was entirely illegal. She was frantically grasping at the shattered remnants of her extortion plot, trying to wield a legal shield she fundamentally did not understand. Gavin did not raise his voice. He did not match her hysteria. He simply leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, and delivered the legal reality with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He smoothly informed my daughter-in-law that the expectation of privacy completely evaporates the exact moment a person commits a felony. He clearly articulated that smashing a reinforced glass door with a landscaping rock to unlawfully enter private property instantly voids any constitutional privacy protections. Gavin explicitly stated that the audio and visual recordings were captured legally within the confines of my personal secured residence during the commission of a break-in and attempted burglary. He smiled a thin, predatory expression that offered absolutely no comfort. He informed Nicole that the state prosecutor would not be concerned with her privacy rights. The authorities would be entirely focused on the extortion, the perjury, the wire fraud, and the conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Nicole collapsed back into her chair, the breath knocked out of her lungs. The legal fortress she thought she possessed had been effortlessly dismantled. The reality of a federal prison sentence finally penetrated Jordan's profound ignorance. His manufactured confidence evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, desperate boy. He threw his hands up in a placating gesture, attempting to rapidly backpedal away from the monumental crater he had dug for himself. He stammered that the recording lacked context. He frantically claimed that they were genuinely terrified for my health, insisting that the sudden sale of his house proved my mind was failing. He tried to sell the narrative that the break-in was an act of desperate love, a misguided attempt to find medical documents to get me the help I desperately needed. It was a pathetic, cowardly display. I did not let him finish the sentence. I slammed my hand flat against the mahogany table, the sharp crack silencing his stammering instantly. I leaned over the scattered photographs and looked directly into the eyes of my only son. I stripped away the remaining illusions governing our relationship. I stated with absolute clarity that he had not acted out of love or concern. He had acted out of pure, unadulterated greed. I told him he had willingly traded the father who spent decades bleeding on loading docks to build him an empire for a bankrupt white family that viewed him with barely concealed contempt. He had allowed his arrogant wife and her toxic parents to convince him that my wealth was his personal entitlement. I articulated precisely how he had chosen to become a felon rather than a man who earns his own living. Jordan shrank away from the table, utterly incapable of meeting my gaze. He had no defense left. His cowardice was exposed for everyone in the room to witness. Having permanently dismantled my son's fragile illusions, I turned my absolute undivided attention to the architect of this entire miserable ordeal. I locked my eyes onto Robert Stanton. The older man was still sitting rigidly in his chair, desperately trying to maintain his aura of upper-class superiority despite the catastrophic collapse of his daughter's extortion plot. He stubbornly believed he was insulated from the fallout. He assumed the criminal charges would strictly target Jordan and Nicole, leaving his pristine country club reputation completely untarnished. I was about to shatter that assumption into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I walked slowly around the edge of the conference table, closing the physical distance until I stood directly over him. I looked down at the man who had spent the last 5 years quietly belittling my blue-collar origins. I informed Robert that I did not spend my entire career building an international logistics network without learning how to conduct thorough due diligence on my adversaries. I told him I knew exactly how he financed the luxury vehicles, the extensive country club memberships, and the designer wardrobes they used to project their fake aristocracy. I knew the Stanton family wealth was a complete and utter mirage. I laid out the stark financial reality he had spent years desperately hiding from his social circle. I detailed the massive crushing leverage pulling his entire life underwater. The color drained rapidly from Robert's face as I systematically recited the specific, humiliating details of his hidden insolvency. The man who had entered the room acting like a king was suddenly exposed as a desperate fraud drowning in insurmountable debt. I did not give Robert Stanton a single moment to recover his breath or formulate a lie. I extended my hand toward Gavin. My attorney silently slid a second remarkably thick red folder across the polished mahogany. I placed my hand flat on the cover and pushed it directly in front of Robert. I told him to open it. I instructed him to look closely at the documents inside as they represented the true, unvarnished legacy of the Stanton family name. Robert's hands trembled violently as he lifted the heavy cardstock cover. Inside lay a complete, devastating forensic accounting of his entire commercial enterprise. I had deployed my corporate auditing division to perform a deep-dive autopsy on his supposedly elite real estate development firm. They had traced every shell company, every hidden liability, every past due notice, and every heavily leveraged asset. I watched his eyes dart across the pages, absorbing the brutal, undeniable mathematical reality. I spoke clearly, ensuring the entire room heard every syllable. I stated that his company had not turned a legitimate profit in over 36 months. They were functionally and legally bankrupt for 3 consecutive years. The pristine country club memberships, the European vacations, and the imported luxury vehicles were entirely financed by a precarious, collapsing house of credit cards and predatory mezzanine loans. He was floating on toxic debt, moving money from one failing account to another, just to maintain the absolute illusion of high society wealth. He had mortgaged his own primary residence to the absolute maximum limit. If a single bank decided to call in a marker, his entire family would be out on the street within a week. Robert swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the dead silence of the room. The paper in his hand shook so violently that it rattled against the glass coaster. He was utterly stripped of his aristocratic armor, exposed as a hollow fraud wearing a suit he technically did not even own. I turned my gaze away from the broken old man and fixed it directly onto Nicole. She sat rigidly in her chair, her face a mask of cornered panic. I explained exactly how the Stanton family had managed to stave off total financial ruin for the past 3 years. I detailed the generous, unconditional monthly allowance I had provided to my son to ensure he lived comfortably while he ostensibly established his own career. It was a massive influx of liquid capital transferred faithfully on the first of every month. I revealed that my auditing team had tracked every single dollar of that allowance. Jordan had blindly transferred the funds into a joint account managed exclusively by his wife. Nicole had then systematically siphoned that exact amount, executing weekly wire transfers directly into Robert Stanton's failing corporate accounts. My son's inheritance was secretly being used to pay the minimum balances on his father-in-law's toxic commercial loans. Nicole did not marry Jordan out of profound love or shared ambition. She married him because she believed he possessed direct, unmitigated access to my vast logistics empire. The Stantons had viewed my son as a highly lucrative, gullible mark. They orchestrated the marriage to secure a permanent financial pipeline to save their own drowning ship. They tolerated Jordan's presence only because they falsely assumed he held the keys to the corporate vault. Nicole had spent years whispering poison into her husband's ear, fueling his entitlement and isolating him from his roots solely to ensure the money kept flowing toward her parents. She had manipulated an insecure boy into betraying his own father, all to fund a fraudulent illusion of suburban royalty. She had sold her marriage to keep her father out of bankruptcy court. I shifted my focus back to Robert. The man was practically shrinking into the expensive leather of his chair. I leaned forward, resting my knuckles on the edge of the conference table. I wanted to ensure he felt the absolute crushing weight of the irony. For 5 years, Robert had looked down on me from his fabricated pedestal. He had sneered at my calloused hands, my lack of an Ivy League pedigree, and my blue-collar origins. He had made countless thinly veiled derogatory remarks regarding my race and my background, operating under the pathetic assumption that his inherited status made him inherently superior. He genuinely believed that running a logistics network of diesel trucks was beneath his pristine, refined sensibilities. I laid out the brutal, undeniable truth. I told Robert that his entire existence, his tailored suits, his private golf rounds, and the roof over his head were actively subsidized by the very sweat and labor he so openly despised. The arrogant aristocrat had been surviving on the charity of a self-made black man. My blue-collar freight money was the exact and only thing standing between his family and absolute destitution. Every time he raised a glass of imported champagne to toast his own success, he was drinking a beverage directly paid for by my trucking contracts. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of racial and class supremacy, remaining blissfully, willfully ignorant that he was effectively my financial dependent. The absolute humiliation struck him with physical force. Robert closed his eyes and lowered his head, entirely unable to defend his shattered pride or justify his towering hypocrisy. His lifelong facade of superiority was permanently annihilated. The devastating revelation hit Jordan like a physical blow to the chest. He spun around in his chair and stared at his wife in sheer, unfiltered shock. The fragile, toxic alliance that had brought them into this boardroom shattered instantly. Jordan had been a willing participant in the extortion plot against me, but he had genuinely believed he was fighting to protect his own household. He firmly believed the massive allowance I provided was funding his luxury vehicles, his extravagant vacations, and his pristine suburban lifestyle. He had completely trusted Nicole to manage the household finances. He had absolutely no idea that she had been secretly draining their accounts to finance her father's bankrupt business. Jordan demanded an explanation. His voice cracked, rising in pitch as the profound scale of her betrayal washed over him. He asked her directly if she had used his father's money to pay Robert's debts. Nicole refused to look at him. She stared rigidly at the polished wood of the table, her silence acting as a deafening confession. Jordan realized in real time that he had sacrificed his relationship with his father, committed multiple federal felonies, and actively plotted to lock me in a psychiatric ward, all for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient financial asset. He was going to face a federal judge and a mandatory prison sentence to protect a woman who was actively robbing him. The realization fractured his mind completely. He backed away from Nicole, his face twisting in absolute disgust. The united front they had aggressively presented just minutes prior dissolved into bitter, toxic resentment. They were no longer conspirators plotting a hostile corporate takeover. They were two cornered criminals who had just realized they were enemies. The air in the boardroom was already thick with the fallout of the Stanton family's financial ruin when Gavin seamlessly seized control of the room. He did not ask for their attention. He simply pressed a button on a sleek remote control, instantly plunging the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline into shadow as the automated blackout blinds descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows. The massive digital monitor spanning the far wall flickered to life, bathing the faces of my son and his in-laws in a harsh, unforgiving blue light. Displayed in magnificent high definition was the exact digital file Jordan had altered the night before. Gavin stepped forward, his custom-tailored suit cutting a sharp silhouette against the glowing screen. With a flick of a laser pointer, he directed their terrified gaze to the bottom of the document. My perfectly replicated, entirely forged signature sat heavy on the authorization line. Gavin then brought up a secondary window beside the fraudulent limited power of attorney. It was the security server log. He traced the glowing red beam of the laser across the screen, systematically breaking down the forensic data. He read the precise internet protocol address aloud, letting the numbers echo off the glass walls. He cross-referenced the geographic coordinates with the exact address of the short-term rental property they were currently occupying. He identified the specific media access control address of the laptop used to alter the file, confirming it was the exact machine Jordan carried in his leather briefcase at this very moment. Gavin explained the mechanics of the digital trap with the clinical detachment of a mortician conducting an autopsy. He detailed how the server had captured their keystrokes in real time, documenting the precise moment they deleted the restrictive clauses and granted themselves absolute dominion over my offshore logistics accounts. The digital footprint was absolute, irrevocable, and entirely damning. Jordan stared at the glowing screen, his mouth opening and closing, as his brain completely failed to process the sheer magnitude of the trap he had blindly walked into. Gavin lowered the laser pointer and placed his hands flat against the polished mahogany table. He shifted his tone from an IT forensic analyst directly to a prosecuting attorney delivering a closing argument. He began listing the specific criminal statutes they had violated over the past 48 hours. He started with the break-in at my estate, classifying it as felony breaking and entering with malicious intent. He moved swiftly to the fabricated petition for emergency guardianship and Nicole's sworn perjured affidavit regarding the firearm, labeling them as a coordinated conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse and extortion. He watched Nicole flinch as the legal definitions crashed over her. But Gavin was not finished. He turned his dead, icy stare back to the glowing monitor and addressed the altered document. He explained that forging a signature on a binding financial instrument constituted severe identity theft. However, the final fatal blow was the method of delivery. By utilizing an internet connection to upload the fraudulently altered document to our corporate servers across state lines, Jordan had elevated a clumsy theft into a federal crime. Gavin pronounced the words "federal wire fraud" with a heavy, deliberate cadence. He informed the room that federal judges do not offer leniency for entitled suburbanites caught attempting to embezzle millions from offshore logistics accounts. He clearly stated that the Federal Bureau of Investigation possesses a near-perfect conviction rate for documented wire fraud. Gavin delivered the final calculation without a trace of sympathy. He informed Jordan and Nicole that the aggregate charges carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years inside a federal penitentiary. There would be no probation, no suspended sentences, and no luxurious plea deals. They were facing a decade stripped of their freedom, locked in a concrete cell. Gavin reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a final document. He did not toss it onto the table. He laid it down gently, sliding it across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of my empty chair. It was a completed formal criminal complaint addressed directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cybercrimes Division. Gavin announced that federal agents were currently on standby, awaiting a single phone call from this very boardroom to initiate a raid on their rental property and secure Jordan's laptop as primary evidence. I stepped forward, reclaiming my position at the edge of the conference table. I pulled a silver fountain pen from my pocket and uncapped it, the metallic click slicing through the suffocating silence. I looked down at the criminal complaint, then raised my eyes to meet the terrified gazes of the people who had conspired to destroy me. I laid out my absolute, non-negotiable ultimatum. The era of their financial parasitism was permanently terminated. I dictated the terms of their surrender. Jordan and Nicole would completely drop the fraudulent guardianship petition. They would sign ironclad legal waivers, relinquishing any future claims to my estate, my corporate holdings, and my personal assets. The Stanton family would completely sever all contact with my son, and Robert would face his bankruptcy without a single dime of my logistics money. I gave them exactly 60 seconds to process the parameters of their total defeat. They had a singular choice to make. They could accept my demands, sign the waivers, and walk out of the building with nothing but the clothes on their backs, or I would sign the federal complaint right here, right now, and they would leave the building in handcuffs. The entire power dynamic of the room inverted in a fraction of a second. The arrogant conquerors who had marched into the corporate office demanding the surrender of my empire were instantly transformed into terrified hostages trapped by their own spectacular hubris. The illusion of their invincibility shattered completely. Nicole began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving as she desperately gasped for air that the room seemingly could no longer provide. The pristine facade of the wealthy, untouchable socialite melted away, revealing a panicked, cornered criminal realizing her entire life was about to be obliterated. She clawed at the collar of her designer dress, her eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors as if calculating an impossible escape. Robert Stanton sat paralyzed, his face a mask of ashen horror, entirely unable to protect his daughter or salvage his own ruined legacy. Jordan physically collapsed under the crushing weight of the federal reality. The final remnants of his manufactured arrogance dissolved. His knees gave out, and he dropped heavily onto the plush corporate carpet. He crawled around the edge of the mahogany table, positioning himself directly at my feet. The man who had sneered at my blue-collar origins, who had plotted to lock me in a psychiatric ward, and who had willingly forged my signature to steal millions, was now weeping uncontrollably. He grabbed the hem of my trousers, his tears soaking into the charcoal wool. He begged for mercy, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He pleaded with me to spare him from prison, promising to do whatever I demanded. I looked down at the sobbing, broken figure on the floor. I felt absolutely nothing. The son I had known was dead, and the felon begging at my feet was entirely a product of his own making. I stepped back, forcing Jordan's hands to slip from the fabric of my trousers. I did not offer him a hand up. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply turned my attention back to the mahogany table and nodded to my attorney. Gavin moved with clinical efficiency. He produced 3 thick, legal-sized document packets from his briefcase and slid them across the polished wood, stopping perfectly in front of Jordan, Nicole, and Robert Stanton. I let the silence hang for a long moment before outlining the absolute parameters of their surrender. I stated that the first document in the packet was a comprehensive, sworn confession. It left no room for interpretation, negotiation, or future legal maneuvering. They were required to detail their entire conspiracy under oath. The affidavit explicitly demanded an admission of the physical break-in at my private residence. It required Nicole to document her theft of my prescription sedatives and outline her specific, premeditated intent to weaponize those medications to secure a fraudulent emergency psychiatric hold. It forced Jordan to admit in his own words, and under penalty of perjury, to the digital forgery of the limited power of attorney and the subsequent unauthorized transmission of that fraudulent file across state lines. I informed them that this confession would be notarized right here in the boardroom and held in perpetuity in Gavin's corporate vault. If any of them ever attempted to contact me, retaliate against my freight enterprise, or challenge my legal autonomy. In the future, Gavin possessed standing orders to immediately forward the sealed confession directly to the federal prosecutor's office. The document was a loaded gun pointed permanently at their futures, and I was forcing them to pull back the hammer themselves. I moved seamlessly to the second phase of my demands, directing their attention to the next set of stapled pages resting on the table. This was the instrument of their absolute financial severance. I required Jordan and Nicole to sign a binding, irrevocable non-disclosure agreement coupled with a voluntary total disinheritance clause. They were to legally and formally renounce any past, present, or future claim to my corporate holdings, my private offshore logistics accounts, my real estate properties, and any personal assets bearing my name. I stated clearly that the legal definition of our family was permanently dissolved in that very room. Jordan would legally surrender his status as my heir. He would walk away from the empire I had built with calloused hands and decades of relentless labor. They would leave this building exactly as they had entered my life, with absolutely nothing that belonged to me. I reiterated the stark reality of their situation. There was no negotiation. There were no counteroffers or revised settlements to be discussed. They had precisely 2 doors available to them. They could sign the documents, accept their complete disinheritance, and walk out into the Chicago morning as free, albeit destitute, citizens. Or they could refuse to sign, and I would uncap my fountain pen, finalize the federal cybercrimes report, resting on the table, and allow the authorities waiting on standby to escort them out of the building in handcuffs. The choice was strictly binary: financial ruin or a decade in a federal penitentiary. The sheer finality of the terms broke through Nicole's paralyzed terror and ignited a sudden, desperate rage. The carefully crafted persona of a refined, untouchable socialite violently burned away, leaving a cornered, ravenous predator in its place. She leaped out of her leather chair, her face contorted with fury. She slammed her hands onto the table, refusing to accept the total collapse of her extortion plot. She screamed at Jordan, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls, demanding that he get off the floor and fight. She shrieked that they could not possibly sign away their legal rights to a logistics empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Her greed completely eclipsed her sense of self-preservation. She turned her venom toward me wildly, claiming that the entire presentation was an elaborate theatrical bluff. She insisted that a father would never actually send his own flesh and blood to a federal prison. She demanded that Jordan call my supposed bluff, insisting that the evidence was circumstantial or legally inadmissible. She ordered him to tear up the confession and walk out of the room, blindly convinced that they could hire a defense attorney to tie up my assets in probate court for decades. She was perfectly willing to gamble their entire lives on the delusional hope that my parental sentimentality would ultimately override my sense of justice. She did not see a father and son confronting a catastrophic fracture. She only saw a massive pile of money slipping permanently through her manicured fingers. Jordan slowly pushed himself up from the carpet, his movements heavy and completely drained of life. He leaned against the edge of the mahogany table for support, his eyes wide and hollow. He looked at the massive digital monitor, projecting the federal statutes, the highlighted wire fraud charges, and the mandatory 10-year minimum sentence flashing in harsh blue light. Gavin's meticulous forensic breakdown left no room for doubt or legal maneuvering. The trap was absolute, and the federal agents were genuinely waiting for a single phone call. Jordan then slowly turned his head to look at his wife. Nicole was still screaming, her face red with avarice, demanding that he reject the waivers and fight for the offshore accounts. The profound, sickening realization hit Jordan with the force of a physical strike. He stared at the woman he had married, finally seeing past the designer clothes and the manufactured suburban perfection. He realized in that agonizingly clear moment that Nicole fundamentally did not care about his freedom, his safety, or his life. She was explicitly demanding that he risk a guaranteed decade in a violent federal penitentiary simply to preserve a fractional, microscopic chance of eventually winning a protracted legal battle for my wealth. She was entirely prepared to sacrifice his existence on the altar of her own insatiable greed. The man who had traded his father's legacy for the approval of a bankrupt socialite suddenly understood the true terrifying cost of his transaction. The alliance between husband and wife did not just crack, it pulverized into dust. Jordan looked at Nicole not with love or partnership, but with the horrified clarity of a man staring directly at his executioner. Jordan remained on his knees for only a fraction of a second more before the paralyzing shock metabolized into a blinding, white-hot fury. He pushed himself off the carpet, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He did not face me. He turned entirely toward Nicole, his chest heaving, his face contorted into an expression of absolute revulsion. The illusion of his perfect suburban marriage evaporated in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the boardroom. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his wife's face and called her exactly what she was: a parasite. The word tore from his throat, harsh and unpolished, echoing violently against the glass walls. He screamed that she had drained him dry, taking his money, his dignity, and his father only to feed a dying, pathetic facade. He laid his own cowardice bare for the entire room to witness, confessing with brutal honesty that he had systematically destroyed his relationship with the only man who had ever truly loved him, solely to buy his way into her family. He admitted he had spent the last 5 years desperately contorting himself into a pathetic caricature of success, just to impress her racist, bankrupt parents. He screamed that he had tolerated Robert's thinly veiled insults regarding my freight business, the condescending smirks at country club dinners, and the endless, suffocating snobbery, believing he was earning his place at an elite table. Now staring at the forensic accounting documents outlining their massive insolvency, he realized he had bought a front-row ticket on a sinking ship. He was fully prepared to let my legacy burn just to keep her father out of a debtor's prison. He took a heavy step toward her, forcing Nicole to shrink back into the leather upholstery. He told her she was completely insane if she thought he would spend 10 years in a federal penitentiary just so she could pretend to still be a wealthy socialite. The transactional nature of their marriage was finally dragged out of the shadows and exposed to the harsh fluorescent light. He was done protecting her. He was done subsidizing her family's delusions. Jordan whipped around, completely turning his back on his wife and his terrified in-laws. He lunged toward the mahogany conference table like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. He did not look at the massive wall monitor projecting his federal crimes, and he did not dare to look at me. His eyes were entirely locked on the thick, legal-sized document packets Gavin had laid out moments prior. He reached out with a violently shaking hand and snatched the silver fountain pen resting near my fingertips. There was no hesitation left in his body, only the pure primal instinct for self-preservation. He flipped open the first folder, exposing the sworn affidavit. He did not bother to read the meticulous legal phrasing detailing his extortion, the break-in, or the digital forgery. He simply dragged the nib of the pen across the signature line, pressing down so hard the paper nearly tore beneath the ink. He flipped to the next page, signing his name again and again, legally confessing to every single felony he had committed against my estate. He threw the confession aside and grabbed the second packet. The binding non-disclosure agreement and the voluntary disinheritance clause stared back at him. He was signing away his absolute birthright. He was legally severing his bloodline from my offshore logistics, accounts, my freight empire, and every single asset I had built over 40 years of grueling labor. He did not pause to mourn the loss of his inheritance or the millions of dollars evaporating with every stroke of the pen. He scrawled his signature across the final page, deliberately trading a vast fortune for the simple guarantee that he would not sleep on a concrete cot in a federal cell. He dropped the pen onto the polished wood. It rolled to a stop, echoing with absolute finality. He had surrendered everything. He had completely amputated himself from my legacy to secure his own physical freedom. Robert Stanton watched Jordan surrender the empire with the dead, hollow eyes of a defeated general. The patriarch of the Stanton family possessed enough lingering self-serving intelligence to recognize when a war was irrevocably lost. The federal cybercrimes report resting on the table was not an empty threat, and Jordan's signed confession had just eliminated any conceivable legal defense they might have attempted to mount. Without my son's complicity and legal standing as an heir, Nicole was completely isolated and entirely exposed to federal prosecution. Robert slowly turned his head to look at his daughter. He did not offer her a comforting embrace or a fatherly word of reassurance. He issued a cold, clipped command. He ordered Nicole to pick up the pen and sign the documents immediately. Nicole stared at him in utter disbelief, her mouth opening and closing in mute protest. She looked toward her mother, but Susan Stanton simply averted her eyes, staring blankly at the expensive carpet. The family solidarity was completely fractured by the sheer terror of federal indictments. Robert slammed his hand onto the armrest and raised his voice, barking the command a second time. He explicitly told her the game was over and she was not going to drag the rest of them into a criminal conspiracy charge. Sobbing furiously hot tears ruining her expensive makeup, Nicole reached across the table. Her fingers trembled violently as she picked up the discarded silver pen. She wept loudly, mourning the loss of the massive wealth she had schemed so viciously to steal as she systematically signed her name next to Jordan's. She signed the confession. She signed the waivers. She signed away her entire future. Gavin moved forward with absolute robotic precision. He gathered the signed documents, checked every signature line, and firmly pressed his heavy metal notary seal into the bottom of each page. The satisfying crunch of the embosser officially locked the legal vault. The wall separating them from my assets was now entirely impenetrable. Gavin methodically collected the notarized confessions and the signed disinheritance clauses. He aligned the edges of the heavy paper stock with a sharp tap against the mahogany table. He slid the entire stack of documents securely into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, decisive click. The physical evidence of their absolute surrender was officially processed and secured. The immediate existential threat to my life's work was completely neutralized. My freight empire, my offshore logistics accounts, and my personal estate were permanently insulated from their toxic greed. I stood at the head of the conference table watching the shattered remnants of my family grapple with the sheer totality of their defeat. Jordan remained slumped against the edge of the table, his head buried in his hands, a completely broken shell of a man. Nicole continued to weep into her palms, her dreams of unearned luxury permanently extinguished by her own hubris. Robert and Susan Stanton sat frozen in their leather executive chairs, staring blindly into the terrifying abyss of their impending, unavoidable bankruptcy. The climate-controlled room reeked of failure and profound regret. I reached out and slowly gathered the high-resolution surveillance photographs and the highlighted server logs that had initiated this slaughter. I stacked them neatly, taking my time, intentionally letting the suffocating silence of the boardroom stretch out and wrap around their throats. I slid the damning evidence back into the interior pocket of my tailored jacket. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the lingering ache of paternal duty. I had meticulously excised a cancerous tumor from my life, and the surgical operation was an absolute success. I buttoned my jacket and adjusted my cuffs. The legal execution was completely finished. It was time to deliver the final verbal death blow. I looked at the four pathetic figures cowering in the blue light of the digital monitor, preparing to speak my absolute last words to them. Jordan remained kneeling on the thick, plush corporate carpet. The sudden rush of adrenaline that had fueled his frantic, desperate signing of the legal documents rapidly bled out of his system, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell of absolute panic. The sheer magnitude of his actions finally registered in his mind. He had traded a guaranteed future of immense wealth for a narrow escape from a federal penitentiary. He looked up at me, his eyes red-swollen, and completely devoid of the arrogant executive persona he had worn into the building. He reached out with a violently trembling hand, his fingers gripping the sharp crease of my tailored charcoal trousers. He wept openly, heavy tears streaming down his face and spotting the lapels of his expensive linen suit. He begged for a second chance. He pleaded with me to order Gavin to tear up the notarized confessions and the disinheritance clauses currently locked inside the leather briefcase. His voice cracked and pitched upward as he asked me how he was supposed to survive. He frantically detailed his absolute lack of personal savings, his heavily leveraged suburban lifestyle, and the impending reality of losing his luxury vehicles and his massive mortgage. He looked toward the Stantons, recognizing instantly that they were a sinking ship anchored to a massive stone of debt, and then looked back at me, begging me not to cast him adrift. He sobbed that I was his father, that I had always taken care of him, that I had always shielded him from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the world. He pleaded with me not to turn my back on him now, desperately claiming he had been brainwashed, manipulated, and blinded by the false promise of elite societal acceptance. He clutched my leg tighter, begging me not to abandon him to a life of poverty and public humiliation. He asked me to remember the boy I had raised, begging me to find some hidden reserve of parental mercy buried beneath the corporate executioner he had forced me to become. I looked down at the weeping, broken man, desperately clinging to my trousers. I did not feel a sudden, overwhelming surge of paternal instinct. I did not feel the urge to reach down, place a hand on his shoulder, and offer him comforting words of forgiveness. I felt nothing but a profound, unshakable clarity. I reached down and firmly detached his trembling fingers from the fabric of my suit, taking a deliberate, measured step backward to completely sever the physical connection between us. I looked directly into his panicked eyes and spoke with a voice entirely devoid of warmth, anger, or sorrow. I delivered the absolute inescapable truth with the precision of a falling blade. I told him that I did not abandon him. I explained that I had spent my entire adult life building a massive freight empire specifically to ensure he never knew the crushing, suffocating weight of poverty. But he had actively viewed that sacrifice as a humiliating burden. He had meticulously plotted to erase me from his life, to appease his new aristocratic in-laws. He had shattered the glass of my home, conspired to steal my sanity, and willingly forged my signature to seize my offshore accounts. I stated clearly that I was not punishing him. I was simply honoring his explicit choices. I told him, my voice perfectly steady, that I simply respected his boundaries. He wanted a pristine, elite family, without the embarrassment of a blue-collar father hauling freight in the background. I swept my hand toward Robert and Susan Stanton, who were sitting paralyzed in their leather chairs. I told Jordan he now had exactly what he asked for. He had purchased his new family with his inheritance, the transaction was officially complete, and all sales were final. I shifted my gaze away from Jordan and locked my eyes directly onto Robert and Susan Stanton. They sat frozen in their executive seats, completely stripped of their smug, manufactured superiority. The staggering magnitude of their 3-year financial deception had been laid bare for everyone in the room to witness, and their singular lifeline to solvency was permanently severed. I addressed them with the clinical, merciless detachment of a corporate liquidator finalizing a bankruptcy report. I advised them to immediately cease acting like displaced royalty and start familiarizing themselves with the classified employment advertisements. I stated that their era of subsidized luxury was permanently terminated. The exclusive country club memberships, the lavish European vacations, and the imported sedans were no longer financially viable options for a family drowning in predatory debt. I looked straight at Robert, informing him that he could no longer rely on the stolen wealth of a self-made black man to maintain his racist aristocratic illusions. I suggested he finally learn the true agonizing value of a hard day of manual labor, as his failing real estate development firm would inevitably be seized by his aggressive creditors before the end of the fiscal quarter. I turned my attention to Nicole, who was still silently hyperventilating in her chair, clutching her designer handbag as if it were a life preserver. I informed her that the massive monthly allowance she had so ruthlessly siphoned from my son was gone forever. They had boldly initiated a high-stakes game of corporate extortion, and they had lost absolutely everything. I told them their free ride was officially over, and the brutal, unforgiving reality of the working class was waiting for them outside the glass walls of the boardroom. I did not wait for a response or a rebuttal. There was nothing left to discuss, negotiate, or litigate in that room. The ironclad legal waivers were signed, the sworn confessions were properly notarized, and my logistics empire was perfectly insulated from their toxic, insatiable greed. I turned my back on the polished mahogany conference table. I walked toward the heavy oak doors with the steady, measured pace of a man who had successfully navigated a treacherous hurricane and emerged completely unscathed. Behind me, the muffled, agonizing sound of Jordan sobbing into the corporate carpet echoed against the glass walls, serving as a pathetic soundtrack to his entirely self-inflicted ruin. I did not break my stride. I did not slow my pace. I did not turn my head to offer a final glance of pity, anger, or regret. I pushed the heavy double doors open and stepped out into the pristine, brightly lit reception area. Gavin followed silently right behind me, his leather briefcase securely holding the physical instruments of my total victory. I walked straight down the wide corridor to the elevator bank and firmly pressed the call button. The polished steel doors slid open immediately with a soft chime. I stepped inside the mahogany-paneled car and turned around to face the hallway. The young receptionist stared in stunned, breathless silence from her desk. Down the long corridor, the faint, muffled sounds of a shattered family tearing itself apart drifted through the air. I stood perfectly still, my posture rigid, and my expression blank as the heavy elevator doors began to close. They slid together smoothly, sliding across my field of vision, and firmly sealed off the complete wreckage of their lives. The mechanical gears engaged, pulling me smoothly and silently downward, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. Exactly 6 months passed since the heavy steel doors of the corporate elevator closed on the shattered remains of my former family. The chaotic, suffocating energy of that downtown boardroom was replaced by the immaculate, hushed serenity of the International First-Class Lounge at O'Hare. The morning sun streamed through the massive tinted windows, casting a warm golden glow across the polished marble floors and the quiet luxury of the private terminal. I sat in a plush leather armchair wearing a lightweight bespoke suit, perfectly tailored for international travel. My luggage was already secured on a direct first-class flight bound for Tokyo. I had spent 40 years building an international logistics empire moving cargo across oceans and continents, yet I had never actually taken the time to see the world I was actively supplying. The relentless grind of accumulating wealth had anchored me to loading docks and corporate offices. That era was officially over. A soft, discreet chime from my mobile phone broke the quiet atmosphere. I glanced at the screen and answered the call. It was Gavin. My attorney did not offer unnecessary pleasantries. He operated with the same ruthless surgical efficiency that had dismantled the Stanton family extortion plot. Gavin called to provide the final official status report on the legal fallout. The structural integrity of my freight enterprise was absolutely secure. The notarized confessions and the signed disinheritance clauses were locked away in multiple heavily guarded vaults. There had been no lawsuits, no desperate appeals, and no attempts to challenge the ironclad waivers. The complete financial severance was executed flawlessly. I listened to his crisp, professional voice, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound peace. The massive bleeding wound that had threatened to drain my legacy had been entirely cauterized. I thanked Gavin for his exceptional service and instructed him to transfer a substantial, completely unprompted bonus to his personal account. The war was definitively won, and the battlefield was entirely cleared. Gavin smoothly transitioned into the collateral damage report, outlining the specific fates of the people who had conspired to destroy me. He delivered the facts without an ounce of sympathy, reciting the outcomes like a quarterly earnings summary. Nicole Stanton had filed for divorce precisely 3 days after walking out of the corporate boardroom. The absolute second the financial pipeline to my offshore accounts was legally severed, the fragile illusion of their suburban romance violently evaporated. She abandoned Jordan the moment he transitioned from a lucrative mark into a massive financial liability. Jordan was now drowning in the catastrophic credit card debt he had aggressively accrued while attempting to maintain his manufactured upper-class lifestyle. Completely cut off from my monthly allowance and facing imminent ruin, my son was forced to find immediate employment. He was currently working grueling, back-breaking double shifts at a regional distribution warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The boy who had sneered at my calloused hands and mocked my blue-collar origins was now hauling pallets on a concrete loading dock just to make the minimum payments on his underwater mortgage. The Stanton family experienced an equally brutal descent into reality. Robert Stanton's desperate attempts to secure emergency mezzanine loans failed spectacularly once the market realized his silent benefactor was gone. His real estate development firm was entirely liquidated by aggressive creditors. The Stantons officially filed for total bankruptcy. The bank foreclosed on their pristine country club estate, and the property was swiftly auctioned off to cover a fraction of their toxic, insurmountable debt. Their unearned racial and class supremacy had been completely pulverized by the harsh, unforgiving mechanics of absolute poverty. I lifted my porcelain cup and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The rich, bitter taste grounded me in the present moment. I looked out through the expansive glass windows, watching a massive commercial airliner gracefully lift off the runway and disappear into the vast open sky. I spent my entire adult life breaking my back in the dirt, sacrificing my youth, my health, and my peace of mind to build a towering fortune. I had willingly accepted the exhaustion and the endless corporate battles because I firmly believed I was constructing an impenetrable fortress for my son. I wanted to ensure Jordan never knew the stinging humiliation of poverty or the desperate clawing hunger of living paycheck to paycheck. I had succeeded entirely, but my success had inadvertently created a monster. By shielding him from the struggle, I had bred an entitled parasitic coward who actively despised the very hands that fed him. The agonizing conflict of the past 6 months had forced me to confront a brutal psychological truth. I had tied my entire sense of self-worth to being a silent, unappreciated provider. The betrayal had shattered that toxic paradigm. It forced me to finally recognize my own inherent value outside of my utility to a family that viewed me strictly as a financial asset. I realized the wealth I had accumulated was never the problem. The unearned, ungrateful entitlement was the poison. The grueling ordeal had completely reset my perspective. I was no longer a beast of burden carrying the weight of ungrateful passengers. I was the absolute architect of my own destiny, and I finally owned the complete deed to my own life. A genuine, unburdened smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of malicious vengeance or petty triumph, but a quiet, profound expression of absolute liberation. I held the first-class boarding pass in my hand, feeling the crisp weight of the cardstock. I was finally deploying the vast, accumulated wealth of my logistics empire on the only person who had actually bled to earn it. I was going to walk through the neon-lit streets of Tokyo, dine in the finest restaurants in the world, and experience a life completely devoid of obligation, extortion, and parasitic guilt. The boarding announcement echoed softly through the luxurious lounge, signaling the official beginning of my new existence. I finished the last drop of my coffee and stood up from the plush leather chair. A sharply dressed flight attendant walked past, offering a polite, deferential bow. I handed her the empty porcelain cup, thanking her with a respectful nod. I picked up my leather travel bag and began walking toward the boarding gate with a steady, unbreakable stride. I left the wreckage of the Stanton family and the ghost of my former son thousands of miles behind me. The harsh reality of the world had finally corrected the imbalance. Blood is merely a biological accident, a random roll of the genetic dice. It guarantees absolutely nothing. Loyalty is the only true currency that makes you family. And the ultimate inescapable truth remained perfectly clear. Crossing a man who built his entire empire in the dirt guarantees that you will eventually end up buried entirely beneath it. The fallout of this entire ordeal revealed another profound truth regarding the dangerous illusion of manufactured identities and the hollow nature of purchased respect. He had spent years desperately attempting to erase his authentic history, to assimilate into a world that fundamentally despised him. He believed that by adopting the superficial markers of the elite class, he could overwrite his authentic origins and secure genuine acceptance. He traded his loyalty, his morality, and his father for a seat at a table where he was only ever viewed as a walking financial transaction. The Stanton family represented the absolute pinnacle of this societal deception. They projected an image of untouchable superiority, cloaking their massive insolvency in designer labels, country club memberships, and inherited arrogance. They demanded respect based entirely on an illusion. The lesson here is that authenticity is the only currency that retains its value when the financial tides inevitably recede. When you build your entire value on the approval of people who evaluate you solely by your utility, you are constructing a mansion on a foundation of quicksand. His catastrophic failure was not merely financial, it was deeply psychological. He sacrificed his authentic self to become a reflection of what he thought Nicole and her parents desired. In doing so, he lost the ability to distinguish between genuine affection and predatory exploitation. He confused access with acceptance. The Stantons did not welcome him into their family. They merely granted him temporary admission as long as the admission fee was paid in full every month. True respect can never be purchased, negotiated, or inherited. It must be earned through integrity, accountability, and the undeniable weight of your actions. By attempting to buy his way into the upper echelon of society, he guaranteed his own eventual destruction. He abandoned a father who offered unconditional support to serve masters who offered conditional tolerance. The moment the capital stopped flowing, the illusion shattered, exposing the absolute emptiness beneath the polished surface. This teaches us that chasing validation from those who demand you discard your roots will always result in a fatal loss of self. You cannot negotiate your humanity with parasites. When you surround yourself with people whose loyalty fluctuates with your net worth, you are never truly safe. The Stantons were fundamentally hollow, sustaining their predatory existence by draining the vitality of others. He willingly offered himself as the host. The brutal reality he faces on that warehouse floor is the direct consequence of trading authentic love for superficial status. The pursuit of manufactured prestige is a hollow endeavor that invariably demands a devastating price. A life built on deception requires constant, exhausting maintenance, and the moment the facade cracks, the resulting collapse is absolute. We must recognize that the dirt on our hands from honest labor is infinitely more valuable than the borrowed gleam of stolen luxury. Authenticity provides armor that no amount of financial ruin can pierce. By embracing our true origins and rejecting the toxic need for artificial, superficial validation, we protect our souls from the corrupting influence of unearned entitlement. Ultimately, the greatest wealth a person can possess is the unshakable certainty of knowing exactly who they are, where they came from, and standing firmly in that truth without apology or compromise. The people who matter will respect the foundation you built yourself, and the parasites will naturally filter themselves out when they realize your integrity is not for sale. This unyielding truth shields you against any manipulation. Never forget that true power originates internally, completely independent of external wealth. Stay authentic, remain grounded, and guard your integrity. If you found this story compelling and insightful, please share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more content, and stay tuned for our next narrative.